I think you have a fairly wide range of motives. You have the history of the Iran-Iraq War, being a state that has been under attack with chemical weapons and missiles. You have its ongoing competition with the United States. You have its desire not only for security, but to expand its influence and power in dealing with its neighbors. To some extent, Israel is an objective, but quite frankly, this is probably more posturing than real. Iran's real effort is to expand its power in the region, not some deep concern with Israel. Well, it's a good question. Probabilities generally grow out of misunderstandings or incidents which you can't predict. I think the fact is there is a risk. Is it a high risk? I think the risk of Israeli preventive strikes, if it sees the negotiations fail and the U.S. fail to respond, is high, even though it would not be particularly effective. It could only delay Iran. As long as you see the negotiations being supported by strengthening sanctions and a growing U.S. capability to actually exercise a military option, I think Israel may show restraint, but that is not predictable, and it particularly would not be predictable if there was a sudden discovery that Iran had moved forward much more quickly than people suspect. But when you talk about the impacts here and the probabilities, the fact is we can say there is a serious risk, but it's not something where you can define it in terms of time or incidence. I think one problem we have had is we have been negotiating now for nearly a decade with essentially threats we never made good on. And by threats, I don't mean military. I mean, the fact is, until real sanctions, a major increase in the U.S. sanctions, the support from the EU, and over time, the strengthening of UN sanctions cut in. And that was only in July, as full effort for sanctions passed in late 2011. There was never really a strong economic pressure on Iran. Now that pressure is beginning to bite. It affects every aspect of the Iranian economy, every aspect of development, of exports, of banking, just ordinary life. And it may be successful, particularly if we're careful to make sure there are incentives as well as disincentives. If it is clear that there is a credible military option, if these negotiations do not work. But actually trying to say that a regime driven by the supreme leader, where the key national security figures are active or former members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards, will react is not something we can predict. Well, I think Americans, everyone in the industrialized world has already lived through several surges in oil prices. None of these surges in the past have ever been the product of a prolonged interference in oil output and oil production. If that should take place, particularly in the kind of economy we have or others have, it would affect 20% of the world's total oil consumption, which affects not simply some theoretical calculation, but the entire transport sector and our economy, and for that matter, virtually all of our imports from Asia. So it affects, essentially, in one way or another, every job, every business in America and in the industrialized world. And in Iran with nuclear weapons, strong asymmetric forces, putting pressure on its neighbors, attempting to dominate the region. That is a threat which is so high that there are reasons why the president has defined it as unacceptable.